Why Tudor queens were doomed from the start. The Tudor dynasty produced some of England's most fascinating and tragic queens. But from the moment they took power, these remarkable women faced insurmountable challenges that made their downfall almost inevitable. Today, we explore why Tudor queens were essentially doomed from the very beginning of their reigns. To understand the doom that awaited Tudor queens, we must first examine the brutal reality of 16th-century politics. England was a patriarchal society where women were viewed as naturally inferior to men, both intellectually and physically. The very concept of a woman ruling in her own right was considered unnatural and dangerous by most people of the time. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind a complex succession that would ultimately place two of his daughters on the throne. But the path to power for these women was fraught with obstacles that their male counterparts never faced. Lady Jane Grey, though not technically Henry's daughter, became the first Tudor queen when she was proclaimed ruler in 1553. Her story perfectly illustrates the impossible position Tudor queens found themselves in. Jane was a brilliant, educated young woman who spoke multiple languages and was deeply religious. However, she was also a political pawn in the hands of ambitious men. Jane's father-in-law, John Dudley, orchestrated her rise to power not because he believed in her capabilities as a ruler, but because he wanted to maintain Protestant control over England and secure power for his own family. Jane herself was reluctant to take the crown, reportedly saying she was not worthy of such a position. This reluctance would prove prophetic. From the moment Jane was proclaimed queen, she faced immediate challenges. Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter, had a stronger claim to the throne and the support of the Catholic population. Jane's reign lasted only 9 days before she was overthrown, arrested, and eventually executed. Her youth, inexperience, and the fact that she was seen as a usurper rather than a legitimate heir all contributed to her rapid downfall. But Jane's story reveals a deeper problem that plagued all Tudor queens. They were expected to rule like men while being condemned for not being men. This impossible contradiction would haunt every woman who sought to wield royal power during this period. Mary Tudor, who became queen after overthrowing Jane, faced her own set of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Despite having a legitimate claim to the throne as Henry's eldest daughter, Mary's reign was doomed by religious and political factors beyond her control. Mary was a devout Catholic who sought to restore England to the Roman Catholic faith after years of Protestant rule under her father and brother. This religious mission would ultimately earn her the nickname Bloody Mary and make her one of history's most reviled monarchs. The problem wasn't just Mary's religious convictions, but the way she went about implementing them. In an era where religious identity was closely tied to political loyalty, Mary's persecution of Protestants was seen not just as religious oppression, but as a betrayal of English independence. Her marriage to Philip of Spain further convinced many English subjects that she was willing to subordinate England's interests to those of foreign Catholic powers. Mary's gender also worked against her in ways that would have been impossible for a male monarch. Her decision to marry Philip was criticized not just for political reasons, but because it reinforced the belief that women were inherently weak and needed male guidance. Critics argued that Mary was allowing her husband to control England through her, something that would never have been said about a king with a foreign wife. The religious persecution that defined Mary's reign was partly driven by her desperate need to prove her authority in a world that questioned whether women could rule effectively. She felt compelled to be more extreme, more decisive, and more brutal than a male monarch might have been, precisely because she knew her authority was constantly being questioned. Elizabeth Tudor, who became queen after Mary's death in 1558, seemed to learn from the mistakes of her predecessors. However, Even Elizabeth, often considered England's greatest monarch, was doomed to face challenges that stemmed directly from her gender and the expectations placed upon Tudor queens. Elizabeth's greatest challenge was the question of marriage and succession. As a woman, she was expected to marry and produce heirs to secure the Tudor line. However, Elizabeth understood that marriage would inevitably diminish her power and authority. Any husband would expect to share in ruling England, and Elizabeth was unwilling to give up the control she had fought so hard to establish. This created what historians call the Elizabeth paradox. She needed to marry to fulfill her role as a woman, but marriage would undermine her role as a monarch. Elizabeth chose to remain unmarried, but this decision came at enormous personal and political cost. She was constantly criticized for being unnatural, selfish, and irresponsible. The lack of a direct heir meant that the Tudor line would die with her, creating uncertainty about England's future. Elizabeth's unmarried status also made her vulnerable to constant plots and conspiracies. Mary, Queen of Scots, represented a particular threat not just because of her claim to the English throne, but because she embodied everything Elizabeth was not: a married queen mother who had fulfilled traditional female roles while also ruling a kingdom. The doom that faced Tudor queens extended beyond individual personality flaws or political mistakes. These women were trapped by fundamental contradictions in how their society viewed gender and power. They were expected to be strong enough to rule a kingdom, but submissive enough to accept male guidance. They needed to be decisive and authoritative, but were criticized when they acted with the same ruthlessness that would be praised in male rulers. The Tudor queens were also hampered by the constant need to prove their legitimacy in ways that male monarchs rarely faced. Their authority was always questioned, their decisions second-guessed, and their motivations scrutinized through the lens of their gender rather than their political acumen. Perhaps most tragically, the Tudor queens were doomed by the very system that produced them. Henry VIII's break with Rome and his multiple marriages created a succession crisis that placed women on the throne during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. These queens inherited problems they had no role in creating, but were blamed when they couldn't solve them. In conclusion, Tudor queens were doomed from the start, not because they were incompetent or weak, but because they were forced to navigate an impossible political landscape that offered no clear path to success. They were pioneers in female rule, but they paid the ultimate price for breaking new ground in a world that wasn't ready to accept women as legitimate political authorities.